Number 5, intrusion prevention, also known as IPS. IPS features on an endpoint is a traditional approach that is still highly effective against fileless malware. While vulnerability scanning and patch management is still your first line of defense against these type of attacks, the reality is that we're not always in a position to update applications as soon as a patch is available, and that's where IPS can help mitigate the risk, by looking for attempts to exploit these known vulnerabilities on your endpoint. IPS has signatures that are specifically looking for vulnerabilities, such as those that fileless malware looks to exploit. Even if you already have an IPS appliance in your network, I would still look at an endpoint with IPS capabilities. Depending on where your IPS appliance sits, there's a chance it may never even see the traffic hitting the endpoint. Also, having an IPS capability on your endpoint means the user is protected anywhere they go, not just when they're sitting behind your network. Some IPS appliances are not specifically configured for client-side attacks, which is the very thing that fileless malware is looking to exploit. If your organization does not have an IPS appliance in place, circle this feature down as a must-have in your next endpoint solution. If you already have an IPS appliance deployed, make sure it's configured to protect against client-side attacks on all outbound traffic. Number 4, sandboxing. A sandbox is like having an entire security research team in your hands to inspect unknown files. A sandbox automates the entire malware analysis process by detonating the file inside a virtualized environment. This virtualized environment can be inside an appliance on your network or off in the vendor's cloud. The goal here is to catch 0 days and other advanced threats that would typically slip through a conventional inspection process. While this is a highly effective way of catching 0 days, it can be both expensive and slow. Depending on the vendor and your configuration, a file can take anywhere between 5 to 15 minutes to be fully inspected. This means you have to either wait for the verdict back from the file before executing it, or allowing the file to pass through and then be alerted if the file is deemed malicious. Of course, that means that a user could be infected by the time the sandbox determines that it's a malicious file. Some sandbox solutions allow you to submit the file off to the cloud, which lowers the cost. However, with this method, if you're offline, you won't be protected. While sandboxing won't be for everyone, if your organization is at risk, there's really no better proven way to catching 0 days than having a sandbox. Number 3, management and alerting. Whether you're supporting 5 devices or 5,000, how we manage these devices and respond to potential alerts is critical to consider on any solution. One of the first questions you may even ask yourself is, will I be managing this in-house or outsourcing to an MSP? From a management perspective, you want a solution that locks down your settings across all your devices. This means your security policy can remain consistent without sacrificing any features. This also means that a user can't disable a solution just because he can't get to Facebook. And while this may sound obvious, it's a common misstep in smaller organizations to give end users admin credentials. From an alerting perspective, some of the things to consider are, how are you going to be notified when an alert goes off? Will it be via email, syslog, SNMP, or some other method? What alerts are you going to be notified about? Most importantly, what's your plan of action when a given alert comes in? If you don't have an incident response plan already in place, I would highly recommend taking a look at the IR playbooks on the video and on the link below. Make sure you know what to do when a given incident occurs. It doesn't have to be as complex as the IR playbooks here, but it could be as simple as, what do I do if a critical system gets hit with malware? What do I do if it's a non-critical system that gets hit with ransomware? These are all things to consider now before choosing your next endpoint to make sure that whatever solution you decide is an enabler of your security mission. Number 2, the fundamentals. Fundamentals are what I consider the bare minimum that every endpoint solution should have included. This will be things like a traditional antivirus database, malicious IP and domain blocking, and botnet protection. Now, I just spent a good portion of the video discussing why this approach is outdated. So why is it critical for our next solution to still have it? Well, for one, a good portion of the day-to-day garbage your average user will run into is still prevented by the basics above. And while you still need to look beyond just these features, it's an important foundation for any solution to have. Secondly, a signature and IP database is really fast and costs very little from a CPU and memory perspective. This is why almost every vendor will continue to have one as a first line of defense before it goes through advanced methods like AI, machine learning, or pattern recognition. Why spend computational resources on something that I may have already run into in the past? Another critical feature every AV solution should have is some sort of anti-exploit feature. Anti-exploit can be called different things from vendor to vendor, but it should always be about memory protection. This feature should encompass different techniques that protect against process memory. This is yet another mechanism against fileless malware, which can use vulnerabilities in known applications to jump memory locations within the system. Number 1. Cost. Because we don't live in a world with unlimited funds, we have to prioritize and select features that make sense for the business. Most antivirus solutions will have annual licenses that are charged per endpoint, with bulk purchasing discounts available. They will generally have either a home or business license, with business use license generally offering more advanced features like the ones on this list. Beyond the features you need, take note of device compatibility and the management system that the endpoint offers. An easy-to-use management system can save you time and money on deploying and configuration, so don't underestimate the value that can bring to your cost calculations. We're seeing more and more vendors consolidate EDR and UBA into a single add-on license, apart from most base packages. Sandboxing will almost always be a separate license, and as I mentioned before, it's generally available as either an on-premise appliance or via cloud. Cloud submissions will be significantly cheaper and less complex, but it will only offer notification as opposed to any type of protection. And of course, it's worth noting that there are good open source substitutions for some of the features on this list. However, unless you have the staff and knowledge to support it, you're generally on your own for any type of support. The CISO perspective. A good security program always documents and measures the qualitative and quantitative risk around the business. When calculating risk, it's important to not just consider the physical assets, but the value of the data as well. Oftentimes, the data is much more valuable than the cost of the physical asset. Losing your $1,300 laptop is one thing, but losing your laptop that contains credit card or healthcare information could cost you thousands more in regulatory fees and public image. Once you've identified the risk around your business, start to prioritize the features we discussed here today on how they help mitigate that risk. For example, if I have important intellectual property that must be kept safe, I may look at an endpoint solution that includes UBA. The UBA features would help me identify insider threats as well as data exfiltration. If I'm a large enterprise that fears being targeted, maybe I look at ATP features with a sandbox solution and possibly EDR. Someone with financial and technical means won't hesitate using a zero-day to infiltrate your business. If I'm a small business, maybe I just want something that will protect me from the everyday threats and block certain web categories. In that case, having an endpoint with strong fundamentals and a vulnerability patch management solution might be the best bang for my buck. If you're an SMB, you're probably going to have a higher reliance on the endpoint than, say, an enterprise would, which probably has multiple layers of security already. While an enterprise may have a patch management policy already in place, an SMB might have to rely on an endpoint solution to fill that need. An enterprise might also have a next-gen firewall at the edge that can take some of the burden off of the endpoint. Whatever your scenario is, we'd like to hear from you. Send us your question and feedback, and don't forget to hit subscribe.